Okay. Tamara Walker is a historian of race, gender, and slavery in Latin America. Her research has appeared in such publications as Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Safundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies, Gender and History, the Journal of Family History, and Souls. Her first book, Exquisite Slaves, Race, Clothing, and Status in Colonial Lima, was published by Cambridge University Press and received the 2018 Harriet Tubman Prize. She is currently at work on a book and digital archiving project focused on Black subjects in Latin American visual culture. I will also post this in chat if you would prefer to read it. So thank you all for being here. This is going to be a fabulous lunch, and I'm going to hand it over to Tamara.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. I'm Tamara Walker, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And so I'll introduce them in the order in which they will present, and then I'll say a few things about logistics just to underscore what Jennifer's already said before giving them the floor. So first we have Mark Campbell, who is a DJ, scholar, and curator. His research explores the relationships between Afrosonic innovations and notions of the human. Dr. Campbell is a former Banting postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Regina and is currently the principal investigator in the SSHRC-funded research project Hip Hop Archives, the Poetics and Potentials of Knowledge Production. Dr. Campbell has published widely with essays appearing in the Southern Journal of Canadian Studies, Critical Studies and Improvisation, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, Culture and Society, and the CLR Journal of Caribbean Ideas. His co-edited collection, We Still Here, Hip Hop North of the 49th Parallel, is set to be launched this fall by McGill Queen's Press. Next, we'll have Andrea Fatona, who's an independent curator and an associate professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design University. She's concerned with issues of equity within the sphere of the arts and the pedagogical possibilities of artworks produced by other Canadians in articulating broader perspectives of Canadian identities. Her broader interest is in the ways in which art, culture, and education can be employed to illuminate complex issues that pertain to social justice, citizenship, belonging, and nationhood. She's the recipient of awards from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the SSHRC, and was the 2017-2018 OCAD UMassey Fellow. Dr. Fatona is the Canada Research Chair, Tier 2 in Canadian Black Diasporic Cultural Production, and she's published scholarly articles, catalog essays, and book chapters in a range of publications. And last but not least is Kristin Moriah, an assistant professor of English at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Her forthcoming monograph, Dark Stars of the Evening, examines late 19th and early 20th century African-American performance, including the circulation of performance within the Black diaspora and its influence on the formation of national identity. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada, the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, and the Harry Ransom Center. So with that, each of our distinguished speakers will each have around 7 minutes, as Jennifer had said, to present their research. Then we'll open it up for questions. And if you can't find the hand raise function, feel free to use the chat and I'll keep my eye on it. But I can also ask Jennifer for help, and others. Feel free to nudge me if you notice that someone has raised their hands and hasn't been called on. So with that being said, I'm going to hand things over to Mark, Andrea, and Kristin, and you guys can just go one after the other without waiting for me to reintroduce you.
Thank you, Tamara. So I have a couple slides that I'd like to share in order to talk about what it is I do and some of the projects according to this theme. And I am now able to do that. So just give me a second here. So I'm working on a couple different projects, and what I'm going to do for the next 7 minutes is really go through sort of my thinking in these projects and how the thinking has evolved or how it's grown in different ways. So I start with this image in the background. This is a former exhibition that was transformed into a VR exhibition. And it was one of the sort of many outputs or many projects that I've been working on for several years.
Sorry to interrupt, Mark. We're not seeing the image.
No?
No.
Let's try this again. Anything shown up?
We see the Google page, the Google homepage.
Amazing. Okay. Let's see if I can try this again. Not sure what happened. My apologies, folks. Looks like this has disappeared on me. Is my screen changing at all now?
Yes, we see the PowerPoint now.
Okay.
Yeah, Afrosonic Archives.
Perfect. My apologies. So Afrosonic Archives is the project, the main project that I'm working on as the JHI Digital Humanities Early Career Fellow at UTSC. And in the background is a VR exhibition of a former exhibition called, I'll get into it in a second. So here's a couple questions that kind of orient my thinking on all of my research projects across the board. How is knowledge produced by Black life? I'm thinking directly in the post-Middle Passage Western context. How might Afrosonic innovations operate as archival? And how do sonic innovations in the Black diaspora contribute to or disrupt the production of knowledge? So these are some of the ideas that have really underpinned what I've been working on for the last couple of years with Northside Hip Hop Archive and some others, which I will talk about in a second. So Afrosonic Audio is the project. It's a research creation project that I'm working on for the next 18 months or so. And what it really does is it attempts to ask a couple different questions around what is the relationship between sonic innovations and Afro-diasporic orality, and how might we think about archival issues outside of some of the constraints of institutional archiving organizations and institutional structures and protocols around, particularly around sound and its relationship. So the image in the background is from an exhibition I had in 2016 that was called Mixtapes, Hip Hop's Lost Archive. And it was really my first attempt at thinking about the role of analog media, and in particular mixtapes as an archival form and what it captures in its in being very ephemeral and disposable, and being also part of sort of the manufactured obsolescence trend. So part of that thinking has evolved from 2016, where it started out as an exhibition of visual artworks that spoke to the concept of the archival and spoke to the idea of the mixtape, which is, for folks that are unfamiliar, I mean, the mixtape is something that came out of hip hop culture as early as 1975, and it's functioned, it has had several functions in terms of promoting music, also as a business card and promoting DJ skills, but also has had other functions as this kind of intimate tool of connectivity, usually, between courting partners, or most of us will remember either you received the mixtape or you tried to give a mixtape to someone if you were trying to impress them into becoming your partner. So Afrosonic Audio is what is sort of the main project that that I'm working on right now. And Northside Hip Hop Archive is something that is 10 years old this year, and it started out as me really wanting to figure out the unknown history of hip hop in Toronto. And now it's, we are working nationwide. On the left side, you'll see all of the different catalogs that we produced for different shows. And I believe there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shows in those 10 years. Sorry, 7 shows in those 10 years, and there's one coming up. But largely the efforts have been thinking through Abigail de Kosnick's important book, Rogue Archives, and thinking about how does one break the rules around archiving in order to include and become, in order to honor the life of people that are outside of the mainstream discursive frames that we'd like to think of as who is human and who is not. So some of the things that we've been doing here, I will say Live from the Archive, Live from the Crates is an online series that was started during the pandemic, which I'll get to in a second. The T-Dot Pioneers exhibitions, it was a trilogy of 3 exhibitions where we just looked at the history of Toronto hip hop artists. ROM Friday Night Live was an event which I'll talk about in a second. That is was an event where we would pack thousands of people into the ROM, and we themed the nights that would connect with past or historical aspects of Toronto's hip hop culture. Conferences, which weren't we've only I think done 2 in the last 4 years or 3 years, and then the VR online exhibition, of which the catalog is right here, For the Record, An Idea of the North, which is something I'll talk about in a second. So For the Record, An Idea of the North is something that was up at the Toronto Reference Library inside the TD Gallery in 2019. And this image here is one of the curatorial things I tried to do, which was playing with the concept of a salon hang and the kind of value that one would have in the images captured in this kind of hanging feature. Inside those golden frames, many of them are sort of found frames that we spray painted gold. Those are images from the Toronto Stars collection housed at the Toronto Reference Library of some of the earliest breakdancing groups and crews that were competing in 82, 83, 84, and 85. This is the same exhibition, but this is the VR edition of the exhibition. So before the exhibition came down, we recorded it in 360 video and produced an audio guide of which. So when you saw Mishi Mi at the very beginning, Mishi Mi does she gives us the gallery tour, and we kind of center her voice in that way, as she's one of those people that folks know a little bit about, but she's easily forgotten archivally in the history of hip hop in Toronto, especially in this present moment. One thing you'll notice there is in each of these yellow arrows, there's a cassette from a radio show in Toronto in different years where one could listen to them inside of the show. Digging in the archive, it plays on the words digging in the crates, where we went across Canada to a couple different cities during the first lockdown, and we did live stream DJ sessions. And the idea was to ask DJs that have been DJing since analog era, prior to 2006, to go into their crates and pull out the most obscure but also influential records in their home city. So we had Winnipeg, Ottawa, Hamilton, Montreal, and we're continuing that now in this new lockdown with a couple other cities, Saskatoon, Victoria, etc. And again, the idea is what is the relationship between the DJ and archiving, and how do they operate as archivists in a certain kind of way? And the last thing I'll mention is a new publication that will be in the Remix Handbook coming out hopefully in the next 6 to 8 months. But this is me DJing a set at the ROM. We had 3,300 people in the building, and I, for this particular set, decided to find old hip hop videos and digitize flyers and other old photos and do a live video mix at this moment during that quote unquote party scene in which, you know, the audiences, many of them weren't born when a lot of the archival images were actually created, etc. So this is I wrote this up into a paper called DJing Archival Interruptions, and it's at the intersection of remix studies, really looking at remix studies, Black studies, digital humanities, and musicology. And just to pull out what I have mentioned there is, I tried to figure out an ethical engagement with oral and sonic innovations indebted to the African diaspora. So I'll leave it there because I'm eager to hear what my esteemed colleagues are doing on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Fatona, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also thank my fellow panelists here as well. So I'd like to talk to you about my research program and project that's called The State of Blackness from Production to Presentation. I'd like to share my screen with you, so I will attempt that now. So my proposed, my research program builds on my experience as a curator in the Canadian contemporary art scene for the past 30 years. It also builds on my PhD research called, oops, I can't remember what it's called, Where Outreach Meets Outrage, Racial Equity Policies at the Canada Council between 1989 to 1999. And what grounds my project are two important events in Canada. The first being the Massey Levesque Commission that started in 1949, and the very important report that was tabled in 1951. The other important event is the Multicultural Act of 1989. So my research hopes to really shape the ways in which the erasure or shift the erasure and access to the works of Black artists, craftspeople, and critics in Canada. We've been erased from the imaginary of who produces visual culture, and that's very clear to me based on my own work as a curator in both public galleries and artist-run centers. One of the most interesting statements that was made to me while I was at the Ottawa Art Gallery as their chief curator by the National Gallery's director was that there was no excellent art created by Black artists in this country, or else he would know where they were. So these are some of the impulses that drive my project. And my research consists of two major areas. One I'm calling Recoding Black Canada, and the second aspect of it is called the State of Blackness Platform. Recoding Canada, Black Canada, sorry, really is about developing software that eliminates the coded gaze, racial equity and gender bias in computer code, and to move towards what MIT computer scientist Joy Budamwini calls algorithmic injustice, and to shift that space of the injustice around the fact that our works cannot be found within these digital spaces. The other component of the project is the collection and the collection of works produced across the country, making sure that the fine arts and craft are dealt with equally to try to break that hierarchy between those practices. So the plan is to collect the works of Black artists and curatorial projects across the country between 89 and 99, working to create new metadata categories to hold the works, really using the framework of diaspora as a way to think through these new metadata categories as well, thinking that the ways in which we categorize this work moves outside of the nation state to take up the kinds of vernacular and language that come from other spaces of Black engagement. So I'd like to talk to you about the State of Blackness website, which I have up here, which again forms the basis for moving towards this new area of writing code. The site came out of a conference held in 2014 of the same name. And I was concerned with the lack of imagery, lack of discursive materials within both galleries and and galleries that look at and take up the works of Black folks. So in 2014, it had a 2-day conference, interdisciplinary conference, which was held at OCAD and Harborfront. And it brought together 42 artists, curators, critics from across the country to discuss what's happening both within galleries and also the educational system. So this site here acts as a particular kind of archive for the work that was done over those 2 days. And I'm also trying to work with the site as a resource site for general publics to actually access some of the works of Black artists to date. I'm also thinking through ideas of citation and what that means in terms of practices of citation and in terms of making connections to our past and bringing that past to the present. So the site itself is dedicated to Ayanna Black, who was one of the founders of Canbaya, Canadian Black Artists in Action. And that organization held a number of major festivals that brought together national and international Black artists to present their works. So on the site, what you will see, I encourage everyone to actually engage the site and explore the site. I won't go through all of its features, but I'd like to show you some of them. So the archive consists of a number of projects that I've been doing since 24. The conference itself, a project called Expanded Context, in which a number of Black curators and critics went to Venice for the 2015 biennial or Biennale. On this page, there's also some links to a podcast of us at the biennial. And so that's also great information. On the site as well is also a project that was initiated, phase 1 of the project with VTape. And VTape is a video distribution center here in Toronto that does international distributions. Myself and a researcher from OCAD, Alicia Lim, went into the archives and of VTape to pull out all of the works that they have in their holdings. So on the site, on this page, there's a link at the bottom that takes you to a document that lists all of these media works at VTape. Another part of the site, another link on the site is also a project I engaged in January and February of 2020 in Italy, in Florence, with the Black History Month Florence group, in which, as a way to start thinking about pushing the tentacles of diaspora, I engaged in the residency working with 5 young emerging artists from all across Italy, trying to think about some of the connections we have in terms of issues around the presentation and production of Black works. And finally, I'd like to show you a resource page that consists of a number of readings that are actually here. If you link to them, those readings are there for you. And it's, I would say it's quite a comprehensive list of both older and more recent engagements in terms of text, some video work, as well as book chapters here. And there is a Facebook page as well, in which I spend a lot of time making sure that there is new information around the works of Black artists and curators that are posted here. There's also a YouTube channel, and that YouTube channel has all of the many of the artists who participated in the project, in the initial conference, speaking about their works and giving us a sense of the range of works produced by Black artists and curators and critics across the country. So I will stop there and take questions and engage in a discussion after. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start not by sharing slides. I'll just post links to the two websites that I'm going to be sort of talking about and the projects that I've been involved with here. So you can take a look at that independently while I reintroduce myself and discuss my research. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you to my fabulous colleagues. I'm just, yeah, I'm excited to hear about their work. My name is Kristin Moriah, and I'm an assistant professor of African American literature and culture at Queen's. I'm speaking to you today from Ajax, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga, adjacent to the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaty. And this place is and will continue to be home to Indigenous peoples. And the work that I do would not be possible without them. And this knowledge informs this research in some regards. So my research and teaching address multiple fields, including African American literature and culture, sound studies, and performance studies. And I think that it's important that I go back to this idea because a lot of the way that I get into the archives and into archival studies is because of my sort of unique position as a Black Canadian who did her graduate work in the States. So in June 2017, I received my PhD in English from the CUNY Graduate Center, where I was awarded the Melvin Dixon Prize for Best Dissertation in African American Studies. I also earned certificates in African American and American Studies. And one of the interesting things about my work at the Grad Center was that as I was coming into the dissertation phase of my project, there was a lot of support for graduate students doing archival research. I think that institutionally there was recognition that archival research was a field in which students at the Grad Center could excel in new ways and be competitive on the job market and when it came for applying for external funding. And so for that particular reason, many of us in the humanities in particular were sort of pushed towards doing archival research. I held institutional research fellowships as a grad center, as well as a fellowship at the JFK Institute at the Free University of Berlin that enabled me to do research in Black performance as it occurred in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I did a lot of work in particular at the Stadtbibliothek Berlin. And strangely, while I was there, I was able to make connections with Christine Bold from the University of Guelph. And she's continued to be a really strong supporter of my work. Since joining the English department at Queen's, I've been working closely with Gabrielle Foreman, the founding faculty director of the Colored Conventions Project and the director of the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University. We established a formal research partnership in fall 2019, and in that capacity, I co-organized the Marianne Chad Carey Civil Rights Pioneer from Delaware to Canada West to Washington, D.C. symposium, which was to be held at the Delaware Historical Society in April of 2020. Symposium was going to be the first of its kind because it was going to bring together academic researchers, independent scholars, and creative professionals from both Canada and the US, whose research has been impacted by the legacy of 19th century editor and sort of force of nature, Marianne Chad Carey. And springing from this symposium, you know, an edited collection was also supposed to be sort of generated. And so we had high hopes. Thanks to COVID, we've actually begun to pivot online as a platform for much of the work that we planned. And we're actually strangely positioned in a really great way to do that. So I'll say that I always actually met with my colleagues, with Gabrielle and the other CCP members via Zoom. So that hasn't stopped us. And the level of professionalism with with which they approach things like producing Zoom webinars is actually both impressive and intimidating. So she has a lot of resources and a lot of expertise, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the organizing principles and some of the things that make that kind of work possible. And yes, Gabrielle does rock. The Colored Conventions Project core team is comprised of a diverse group of dedicated and energetic professionals, graduate students, librarians, undergraduate researchers. Many of them were based at the University of Delaware, where the Colored Conventions Project sort of was first born, right, in a grad seminar. Now that Gabrielle has moved to Penn State, a lot of those people have also moved with her. And so, you know, project members represent a wide range of academic disciplines. As a North American teaching partner, you know, when my work with Gabrielle is dedicated to sort of helping to understand how some of the same movements that drove African Americans to organize in the 19th century also impacted Canadian Black organizers in the 19th century. And in this way, I've been able to sort of bring some of the digital tools and techniques that the Colored Conventions Project is known for into my classroom in the English department. The larger project that Gabrielle organizes, CCP, has been recognized with awards from the Modern Language Association, the American Studies Association, the Popular Cultural Association, as well as grants from the Annie H. Mellon and CLEAR. Where else to begin? The Transnational Project is dedicated to recovering the history of the Colored Convention movement and its participants in both Canada and the United States as they advanced Black visioned, Black executed efforts that demanded that Black lives and Black equality and Black dignity mattered. And I think that one of the most meaningful parts of participating in this project for me is really helping my students to gain some nuance into the understanding that the United States is only where Black history happened, right? And sort of thinking about the connections between some of the movements there and some of the movements here, the way that Black Canadians from very early on were actually quite vocal about some of the challenges they faced, about the racism that they faced in Ontario, has been really important to me. We look at a lot of minutes, we look for documents that may have been overlooked or that are not often consulted. One of the interesting things about the project as I brought it into my English classroom is that at first it seemed as if my students would be at a disadvantage because we don't have access to a lot of the digital resources and digital newspapers in particular that students in the United States who participate in this project often make use of. But I was wrong. The fact that my students had access to things like the historical database of the Globe and Mail actually gave them an advantage. The fact that they could go into the basement of our library and look at older reels of local Black newspapers in Kingston actually put them at an advantage, right, in this way. And I think helps drive home the idea that Black history happens here in Canada too. And that those contributions are actually valued in terms of a wider framework of Black studies. Obviously, I undertake this work, you know, as a commitment to recovery that includes sort of historical and activist redress, but also at a time in which my university, like all public universities and institutions in Canada, are wrestling with the practical and intellectual implications of what it means to incorporate principles of equity and diversity into every level of the institution, and with their ongoing desire to sort of foster international collaboration. You know, I'll close with a sort of brief meditation on some of Jennifer Morgan's words in the recent social text issue on slavery in the archive. And, you know, in that article, Morgan reminds us that the starting point for Derrida's archive fever was a consideration of the violence rooted in the state and the ways in which the archive both produces possibilities and structures a series of erasures. The possibilities that the Colored Convention Project presents can at times feel boundless, particularly in the fields of teaching and mentoring. CCP is organized according to a dynamic collaborative process that feels opposed to a lot of the traditional ways of working in academia, right? Gabrielle knows how to train people up and bear the devices. She's been a fantastic mentor for me and for the other graduate students that she works with. And I think that it's the kind of training that I wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to as a grad student in Canada, right? It's often informed by a sort of particular kind of work that you would see paralleled in places like the Ford Foundation. On the other hand, I worry that some of the ethos of the early conventioners themselves and early CCP participants, right, this kind of grassrootsy, University of Delaware grad student spirit is sort of lost when the project becomes sort of folded into larger institutional structures. And we can think about that, or maybe talk about it a little bit more in the conversation. But I'll say that I wonder what we can learn from the project, what I can learn from the project, while maintaining a certain level of wariness or opacity around Black Canadian studies and Black Canadian archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin, Andrea, and Mark. It's kind of a shame for all the upsides of Zoom. One of the downsides is that you don't get to hear the applause. Hopefully you can see it because people have used the applause feature, but maybe we can all plan at the end to unmute ourselves so they can hear a bit of our applause and appreciation. But in the meantime, the floor is now open for questions. And again, you can use either the hand raise function or the chat feature. I'll keep an eye on both. And maybe while people are thinking of questions, I really liked, Kristin, at the end of your presentation, you talking not only about the possibilities of this kind of work in terms of the possibilities of collaboration and kind of boundary crossing and the creation of new kinds of discursive spaces. And then you also kind of pointed at the direction of what some of the challenges might be or what can potentially be lost in this work. And I wondered if Mark and Andrea had similar thoughts around both the possibilities, but also because you've talked very clearly about possibilities, but I wonder if you have grappled at all with potential challenges for the types of archival work and collaboration that you're focusing on in your work.
This is Andrea. So I think about my work really as a particular kind of developing a repository, and part of developing that repository means to go out and find the data, not actually needing the actual objects themselves. And the writing of metadata as well to reclassify and recategorize these objects. I think the challenge that I see is that this is a very slow process because it's a co-creative process. It's a co-design process that needs to work with users of the material, both those in institutions, academic institutions, in the arts sphere, but really general users. That will require a lot of time. And so the slowness at which this type of work needs to take place in order to make sure that ethical considerations are held centrally, I think will be part of the issue I will deal with as a challenge to this project. But it is a challenge that I feel quite ready to step up to because of the need to change the kinds of relationalities we have with our communities and the ways in which we actually work from a non-extractive frame in terms of acquiring and reframing this material.
I would totally agree. It took me several years to slow down and to figure out that the work that is is being done. It really wasn't until I read in the special issue that a recent special issue, the article on slow archives, that I was really like thinking about the rates at which the institutions that you work in. So since I started Northside Hip Hop, I've been in this is my fourth academic institution. The rates at which we are asked to produce and perform, sometimes it doesn't jive really with our relationships to community. and the people that we feel responsible to when we do this work. And also just thinking about the metrics of success. Like in this work, it's hard to detail to those that you're accountable to. So, you know, I've been funded through Canadian Heritage and Canada Council and Ontario Arts Council, and, you know, their metrics of success are not my metrics of success. So it's one of those things where you got to keep your eye on the prize in terms of being ethical and moving through communities that that don't get the kind of attention or haven't had the kind of detailed attention to, in my case, you know, works sonic life in any kind of way. So those are some of the challenges.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, which is moving quickly, so bear with me. One question comes from Elspeth, who was asking Andrea who the artist is that made the work behind you.
Sorry, I just placed it in the chat. It's by Toronto-based artist Esma Mahmoud.
Oh, okay. And then, Lori, did you want to ask your question out loud, or would you rather I read the question?
I can ask it out loud.
Okay.
So let me just pull it up. So thanks everyone for great presentations. Can you each say a little more about how your disciplinary homes affects the way you pursue both archival work and work on the African diaspora, how these things intersect differently depending on disciplinary norms? And I you know, as I was listening to the presentations and thinking about the different backgrounds you're each coming from, you know, I have in the back of my mind ongoing conversations about Black studies in Canada. And, you know, I'm not necessarily sure that like having formalized Black studies departments would like revolutionize anything in the academy, but it was still something that I was thinking about. And I'm not sure if that's something that you see as desirable or that would be helpful to your work or the way that you train students or things like that.
I'm happy to start, but also to say that, you know, to bear the devices and say, Lori, I'm also often inspired by your archival work and your archival research. And, you know, I know that you spent a lot of time going through archives in Grenada, and the way that you're able to make that legible in a literary field is impressive. I think that one of the things that has made my work or enabled my work possible is that I was trained by interdisciplinary scholars. And so I come from an English department that was very, very interdisciplinary. Nobody ever told me no. And I was told to go forth with the understanding that it was difficult to find traces of Black life, but that they were always in fact there, right? That you actually have to do that legwork. And so, you know, like everybody else, part of my experience going into the archives is almost always having somebody tell me that there's nothing relevant there, that, you know, the work that you want to do is not really possible. And then just saying like, I have a lot of time. I have to sit here and, you know, I'm going to find it anyways. And so, you know, thinking about what Black Studies departments can do in terms of fostering this research, I do think that it's actually really, really important to train scholars to bring people up who are coming from a place where they, you know, understand that that's actually just part of the field. It's just part of the work. It's not unusual.
Do you want to go ahead, Andrea?
No, you go.
I was going to say that my disciplinary home is really, for me, I don't feel like I operate within one. So Black Studies really informs how I think against where I'm housed and how to think out, you know, outside of the limitations of that particular discipline. Out of my master's degree, I came out of history, and after doing a degree in history, I was ready to only work interdisciplinary. So for me, you know, I like to think about Black geographies in musicology, because those things, you can't have that conversation in musicology. You can't talk about the importance of a hyper local mixtape to the development of a Black identity in a, you know, in a particular borough of New York City. That just doesn't happen in musicology. So being able to sort of take from other disciplines and rub up against the one that you're in is how I kind of approach the work.
So I come out of sociology and equity studies and interdisciplinary research to begin with, and now I'm housed in a curatorial department, which is itself quite interdisciplinary. There's a kind of burgeoning critical museology, critical curatorial studies space, but like my other colleagues, I'm really grounded within the space of Black studies because these are the spaces that bring the necessary tools to me to interrupt the disciplines I'm engaging with. I, again, really depend and by the texts, writing, and practices that come out of Black studies to actually allow me to breathe and continue to do the work within the strictures that I've been housed in. So Black studies is quite important to me as a space, yet at the same time, it's really important for me to be in these disciplinary spaces outside of that to interrupt the narrative and the practices as they continue to be reproduced in those spaces.
So we had a second question in the chat from Catherine. Would you like to read that one aloud?
Yes. Sorry, everybody, about that. Thank you for your talks. They were so great. So this actually speaks a little bit to Lori's question. Can you talk about diaspora and the crossing of boundaries and how that informs the archive, and thinking about the archive outside a model that is bounded by the nation? And so I think I really like the idea of a moving archive, whereas a student said to me yesterday in a defense, a live archive. And so can you talk about that a little bit, and how that informs your work and how that's, I guess, speaks to diaspora?
So, okay, you go. No.
Kristin, do you want to jump in?
I'll start. Yeah, I'll go. I think that the Black communities that I'm interested in at the turn of the 19th century, and also, the point at which people were actively holding colored conventions, weren't bound to ideas of the nation state in ways that other people were. For them, there was a Black community, right? It existed here, it existed there, but people were connected often through print culture. And sort of moving forward with that idea, right, that the sort of Black community, that Black literacy, that Black culture has always been sort of following these circuitous routes and patterns, then informs, I think, my own kind of disregard, right, for those sort of national boundaries, and understanding that I can take those other tools that people are using in other spaces and bring them up, and sort of also take my own tools and other people and sort of shift them down there if needed, right? That in fact, that sort of boundary crossing and going back and forth and sort of sharing is crucial, and it's a connection that that binds me actually to the 19th century.
So this is Andrea. Diaspora gets evoked in my work, and the notion of moving archives through the notion of moving aesthetics and traveling aesthetics that evolve based on the geographies they end up in. So I think about diaspora conceptually in the works, but I also think about diaspora conceptually in the design of this State of Blackness platform I'm working on. In that I want to make links to spaces outside of this nation state called Canada, but more so I also want to think about categories, language, and the ways in which languages and ways of describing, ways of living that are grounded in other places, but inform the ways in which our artists, curators, critics, and consumers of the work actually understand and participate in the framing of culture. So those are the ways I'm thinking about diaspora and the need to make links. I'm really quite taken by this notion that diaspora has to be performed to come into being, that it just doesn't exist. So part of what I'm trying to do is make that existence and the connections and intersections, but also the transformations in terms of the ways in which works transform, ways of talking about them. The discursive element of the work as well shifts from place to place. So those are the ways I'm thinking about diaspora conceptually and practically in my project.
Thanks for this question, Catherine. It's a great question. And, you know, when I was doing, in 2016, when I did that mixtape exhibition, one of the things I had quickly learned, and I remembered this from being 15 and getting my hands on mixtapes out of New York City, is that cassettes, especially once they became, cassettes were always subverted, right? And they traveled along routes, diasporic routes, so that if you were a kid in Ottawa or Winnipeg or Edmonton and you went to New York in the summer to visit your cousins, you came home with a mixtape. And sometimes that was from the radio, other times it was from a recent DJ. And like my entry into the world of DJing at 15 was through mixtapes that arrived through New York. So I think about that all the time, in which we are always moving outside of different currents. Like people don't imagine that there's a flow between Edmonton and New York City, or Ottawa and New York City, of Caribbean youth. So it really animates my work in trying to think about, also trying to think about what gets captured and I'll use just the example of a mixtape, because the way that people are speaking on those mixtapes are also capture a moment in time, and the way that the DJs are mixing records, you know, reflect what the technology was like at the moment. So I try to think of those things as, every time we could go back to a mixtape every 10 years and capture something different. There's always a relationality in it, even as we think it might be archived and quote unquote dead.
We have another question from Asha.
Yeah, so my question actually kind of builds off the other one, because it's kind of also about diaspora. Because I think a lot of your research sort of is founded on Black Canadian history and Black Canadian culture. And I was wondering if you had trouble sort of distinguishing that from, say, Black American history and culture, or that of other diaspora communities. And do you think it's important to sort of distinguish it as a thing in and of itself, or are they sort of inherently connected to each other?
Yeah, I think that they're inherently connected to each other back at their earliest roots. And I think that there is often a lot that African Americans can learn about Canadian understandings of Black diaspora. And particularly thinking about the relationship between, Black Caribbean people and Black communities in Canada. Yeah, absolutely.
I think I might have missed part of the question in a way, but I do believe, yes, they are connected, yet at the same time, I'm trying to really also work through some of the specificities of Black Canadian diasporic productions, given, I believe, in particularly within the visual arts, in that I believe there are a number of spaces of coming together across all of those geographical sites you've spoken about. Yet there's also something quite interesting about the relationships across this country between Black artists, curators, and critics that has developed something that I dare to say is very unique. And I'm trying to parse out what some of the characteristics of its uniqueness are. But I do believe that there's something here that's quite specific, and specific also, as I said, within the geographical regions across Canada, in which Blackness, based on issues of settlement and the temporal frames of settlement, express themselves very differently.
I think I would, I'm not sure if I can remember the entire question, but what I would say about the relationship between diasporas in Canada and America is I think the work to be done is to figure out what are the characteristics that allow for kind of an ethical type of life in each of these spaces, so that whatever relationships there might be between Canada and the United States, what might be interesting to pursue is to think about the characteristics of and similarities of these diasporas and their role in living a kind of ethical life. So like, for example, when I think about hip hop, it now has global reach, but before, you know, when LL Cool J and Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, when they were all teenagers, when they came to Canada, they quote unquote became international stars. And this is one of the first places they could come to because they could drive over here. And that's never lost on me in the stories of, you know, hip hop in Canada and the lack of, and how, you know, the Americans are so different than the Canadians, etc. It always reminds me that there's this connection that if you dig deep enough, you'll find that, you know, before B-boys were traveling, you know, to compete in the Olympics in the 80s, some of these artists were still driving up to Toronto and being brought up to Toronto by promoters here and DJs here to actually grow their careers, to develop careers on an international and global scale.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. And maybe I can abuse my role as moderator again with the question that comes to mind just by virtue of being an historian who works on primarily the 18th century. And so one of the things I think about, and I try not to kind of fetishize the archival experience as it's understood by conventional historians, but one of the things I think about when it comes to digitizing archival records is that it often means the loss of that kind of experience of having to navigate the rules and the constraints of the archive and communicate. I mean, I work on Latin America, so it means kind of traveling to places like Peru and communicating in the language and having some understanding of the conventions of the community that produces the archive. And I wonder if any of these concerns apply to the kinds of archives you're creating in terms of them being accessible to people or to communities that don't have the same degree of investment in the culture or in the conventions of the kind of histories and communities that are being represented in the spaces that you're creating.
So the repository I'm building here, this platform, I believe I'm very clear that this platform is really about creating resources for educational institutions and curators, critics, galleries. So there's a certain level of users and researchers that I'm really interested in, particularly in this moment where a number of these institutions are saying that they're decolonizing and needing to engage in inclusive practices. So that's an outward facing part of the use of this repository. The other aspect of the project is for Black artists, curators, and critics themselves so that we can get to know each other. A big part of what happens in this country because of the lack of documentation, the lack of discursive materials about exhibitions, artists, and curators and critics, is that in a way, we don't know each other. In a way, we don't know the histories that preceded us. And so this is really, for me, and it might sound kind of odd, but it is a project that is there so that we can actually be able to trace a genealogy of our productions. So I'm seeing it really in a certain way, very focused towards particular kinds of users. Art, like I say, I teach young artists. I know Black artists are out there in our communities trying to find our histories. For example, the first touring Black feminist contemporary art exhibition took place in 1989 by a group of artists called, a collective called Dawa. And this work is now being, we're trying to make it visible again. There wasn't much writing around it. Alice Ming Jim wrote her MA thesis on it. And this was a very, very, very important exhibition. And so this project is really actually to create visibility for this history, particularly for researchers, curators, and those of us in my communities of artists needing to access this history. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Absolutely.
And I also think that the process and practice of co-creating categories and metadata with users is also a way to create a space in which folks will also be part of designing the type of access they need to have to this material. So I feel that it's built into the project in certain ways, and I know that these ideas will definitely evolve and transform based on the input of users at all levels.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think what will be different, I guess, in creating digital platforms and archives is we will lose the relationships that we have to form to get material out of an archive. But when you're building something, the relationships that you form on the ground that can ethically inform how you move forward are sort of that new relationship that has to be cultivated, right? Like at some moment, metadata might work for a particular library or institution, but if it doesn't work for the people that you're serving in your community, then you gotta develop something. You gotta come up with new metrics and new ways of describing the content.
Drawing attention to the work of women like Marianne Shad-Carey, although, you know, it seems sort of quaint to be attached to her as a figure, I really do think can refigure our understanding of Black Canadian literature and the kinds of interventions that were being made very, very early on in Canada. Right. This is a radical Black woman who formed her own newspaper, who traveled back and forth across the border when that was actually still a really dangerous undertaking, who went out of her way to speak publicly in, you know, political settings. And that's actually the roots of Black Canadian literature. You know, whether or not the sort of structures that contained her work and housed her work are sort of still available to us, that actual print culture, making that available, making the minutes of these conventions, seeing who was and who was not able to speak, who was and who was not present, actually can change our understanding of what it means to be Black in Canada.
So I think with that, we are at time. I wonder if you all can join me in unmuting just to give our presenters a round of applause. Thanks, everyone. I don't know, Jennifer, if you had any final words to close us out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, the presenters. This was an absolutely fabulous session. I think many of us agreed based on the chat. I will make this recording available within the next week or so up on the DHN website. Let me get the link and drop that in chat real quick for you. It will also be available on our recently discovered YouTube page. We're making a whole compilation, so that can also be accessed from the DHN website, which is now in chat. Just a big thank you to everyone who came. This has been fabulous. Take care.